Hello, everybody. Welcome back for another Share Your Experience. I'm Holly, one of the conscious agents here with Reality Sandwich. And today I am joined by Sean Lawlor. I had the opportunity to read Sean's book these last few months. It's called Psychedelic Revival Toward a New Paradigm of Healing. And you may have caught the review I wrote on Reality Sandwich. If not, I'm dropping it in the notes below. It's a fantastic book. I hope you all pick it up. We'll get into that a little bit. But first, I want to welcome Sean. Thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here with you.
Awesome. Well, I loved your book. Thank you for writing it. It was a fantastic read. And I think there are a ton of incredibly important principles in there for people that are either new to psychedelics or maybe are looking for a deeper perspective on their experience or the industry as a whole. So before we talk about your book, because I do have some questions about that, I just want to hear a little bit about your backstory. What led you to writing this book? How did you first encounter psychedelics or take an interest in psychedelics?
Yeah, I was in my early 20s, so I was about, I think it was my junior year of college, and I made the very practical decision to study philosophy. And it was kind of amid that time when I traveled for the first time. I was fortunate enough to do a semester abroad in Australia, and it was just an amazing time in my life. Like I'd come from a pretty kind of conservative Midwest background. Like um, I got the full on dare education as a kid. Any association with psychedelics was just like those are as like the worst things in the world.
Yeah,
Um,
totally.
and I just got to know people who either had taken mushrooms or in their distant past or like had just taken them, like some pretty good friends. And I was just more open-minded, I guess, at this point in my life. Like I kind of felt like this inner curiosity button had just kind of like gotten turned on in the last year. And hearing the way they described them was really intriguing to me. They just describe, I remember a lot of people saying it felt kind of like you remember what it was like to be a kid. And, I know that's not ubiquitous by any means, and it gets a lot more complicated than that. But, maybe at that age and early experiences, that can happen. But I also had a professor there, a philosophy professor, who was like basically encouraging us to take mushrooms. This
That's
Australian guy, like without explicitly saying it, he'd be like, like when you're on mushrooms.
awesome.
There's just
Those
some
wheels
signs.
turn in, kids. Like,
Yeah, exactly. And I found some through, it felt like a good trusted source, and it was a perfect day with friends and some friends with experience, and we decided to take some. I think it was probably a really small dose. Like we just kind of did the old method of splitting the bag, eyeballing it, and it was just kind of perfect, like a pretty perfect day. I think I kind of describe it a little bit at the very beginning of the intro to the book. um, but yeah, around that time, I was reading a lot of writing about psychedelics, like Aldous Huxley, The Doors of Perception, and I was learning about Timothy Leary and kind of like all those like entry points into the world of psychedelics, and just the idea of like this, like access to um, consciousness or like the unconscious mind that is typically inaccessible, and kind of perceiving what the brain usually filters out was really intriguing to me at that time. And I did feel like mushrooms kind of allowed me to see more deeply. I was also really interested in like mysticism and just like real immersive presence, and felt like it kind of provided that kind of experience in a way that, I still, when I think about it, I can access some feelings that are still there, some really wonderful feelings.
So it was a positive first experience with psychedelics. Like sounds
Yeah,
like
totally.
sounds like a pretty chill day with friends.
Chill day with friends. Yeah, yeah.
Outdoors, indoors.
Outdoors. Yeah, I was outdoors at this park. It was a nice little pond. I remember I listened to one song, and songs can just kind of like become like,
A
yeah,
theme,
forever remembered and
total
associated.
anthem. Yeah,
Yeah, and it was "Walking on a Dream" by Empire of the Sun, which was just kind of perfect for that particular day.
nice, nice.
Yeah.
And I know, tripping on mushrooms in a group can always be like, a roll of the dice. Like, did it feel like everybody in your friend circle was like on the same wavelength? Like everybody was just vibing at the same pace?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, there was no conflict. Yeah, it was like everyone kind of got closer. There's one friend who started to feel sick, and he was struggling a little bit, and then I remember just kind of sitting with him for a while and talking with him as he laid down, and putting on some music, and he felt better by the end. And that point actually became a reference point later when I was considering, like, do I want to do psychedelic therapy? I was like, well, that felt just kind of intuitive and natural, and I really liked being with my friend and that. And come to learn, it's very different with psychedelic therapy, but yeah, he was still like on the same kind of wavelength and stuff. And yeah, I mean, we just all had such a, with the exception of the period where he felt sick, we all had a really, really amazing day.
Nice. So, since that experience, has psilocybin kind of been your substance of choice, or have you branched out into exploring other plant medicines and psychedelics?
I've branched out into exploring. Yeah, I would say LSD has become my substance of choice.
Same.
Yeah, it was, yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
With you there.
yeah. Gotcha. Nice, nice. It was 3 years later, I think, when I tried that for the first time, and that was at a music festival in Washington, actually, at the
Nice.
Gorge Amphitheater.
Oh, perfect. What festival or what bands were playing?
It was called Sasquatch.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah,
Yeah,
what a great time. Yeah.
yeah, great time. That night, I saw Jack White
Oh,
play, and
hell
yeah,
yeah.
it was awesome. It was
That's awesome.
amazing. Like, I liked Jack White and stuff, but seeing him play guitar live in that state, I was just like, what am I witnessing right now? This is like, it seemed like a kind of like magician with like a
Yeah.
magic staff. He could just like,
He's such a character. So yeah,
such
that's
a character, yeah, and just such an amazing guitarist. Like, holy cow.
hmm.
And Tenacious D played that night, so I saw
Oh,
Jack
nice.
Black, which was, yeah, wild. Jack Black and Jack White.
Nice. A little black and white LSD trim. Okay, cool, cool.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But again, with friends, amazing connection. And yeah, I mean, that was 12 years ago, I think, at this point. And yeah, I've had some more challenging experiences since on both mushrooms and LSD, which were good. Like, in hindsight, I learned a lot, and they're important. But yeah, LSD for some reason has just felt like the most helpful one, the one I'll kind of like come back to and get a certain amount out of. I've explored, yeah, with varying doses of mushrooms, ayahuasca a couple times, ketamine, MDMA. Um, it might be, and mescaline. Yeah,
Mm.
mescaline wasn't. I think Michael Pollan called it the orphan psychedelic. Like, it just kind of like
Just out
was big
there.
and went away. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Not
if
a
it
lot of
was,
people are doing mescaline these days, it doesn't seem like.
no, no,
I
yeah, unless it's in cactus form.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Um, but that was amazing. If that was maybe as easily accessible, I'd be intrigued to explore that.
Okay. Do
That
you think does it feel as psychedelic as like LSD? No.
no,
No.
mm-mm.
Okay.
No, it felt like like everything that's there already just becomes like more there, or like you're more there, like
Okay.
with everything.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah, there's like real enhanced uh, like presence and embodied kind of presence, and there was like some kind of visual distortions, but I just felt so deeply connected with like everything in my immediate surroundings. Yeah, it was really, really beautiful.
Nice. I like that you said you've had some challenging times with psychedelics, but you didn't call them bad trips, which I appreciate because I don't think there's any such thing as a bad trip. Um, Despite my mind immediately taking me to some like harrowing places that I've been. But again, I would say the same thing. I wouldn't say bad, I would say challenge because no matter how uncomfortable, I feel like I've always come out on the other side with like, oh yeah, wow, there was that nugget of information that I needed, or et cetera, et cetera. Has that kind of been your experience too, coming out on the other side?
Yeah, yeah, totally. Um, there's always something, and it's been yeah, been different and some some different challenging experiences.
Fair,
Um,
fair.
yeah, sometimes it's just like kind of looking back at a kind of carelessness maybe that I had, and convincing myself, oh, I'm being really careful and mindful with taking this, but then more in hindsight, like, no, not really. Like, you didn't pause and like reflect enough, and things went a little haywire. That's why it's really important to be more intentional and mindful when you're going to take these things and make sure bases are covered, and yeah, that you've got as much kind of under control as you can with the set and setting. And then other times, it was way more like introspective, like insight into deep like patterns of my like way
Mm.
of perceiving and being that I hadn't quite recognized or named before. Like, to get specific on ayahuasca, the second of two times that I experienced it, it was like 2 nights on two different occasions of the year apart, and this is the second occasion. Um, there was a lot of throwing up going on in like the room, and like didn't want that to be happening and didn't want to be hearing that, and like I felt not good, and I was like kind of wanting to turn away, and I noticed this like inner turning away, and I there was like a question that came up, like, what are you turning away from? And that opened up just this insight of like turning away from suffering, like in myself and as I like see it externally, like, which maybe was kind of leaning too much on like think positively and that kind of mentality. But yeah, it felt like a disrespect to the reality of suffering and the way that people experience and the way that I experience it, and there was a lot of fear in that, and so I like turned toward the suffering and had this image of something really kind of nasty, grotesque looking, and just like was stayed with that and kept breathing with that. And so, yeah, it was kind of dark before that, but I guess it kind of falls in line with the classic psychedelic therapy thing of like turn toward what you fear, and it can strip the fear of its power, and then you can gain some insights through that.
Yeah, sitting with the discomfort. There's a lot of like I think in psychedelic world there's a lot of shadow work, but the energy does also tend to be like, a lot of high optimism and looking for the good, etc. But it's just such that yin and yang. Like it's impossible to appreciate beauty without acknowledging the suffering too. I mean, we just I think that is a big part of psychedelics. I can relate to that as you're telling that story. I had an ayahuasca experience like that too. Like there was a night that was just so muddy and ugly and gross, and it's like you just have this like bubbling high and you want it to be beautiful and transformative, and it's like, why do I have to sit through this? But years later I'm still uncovering things that come up from that experience I had that I'm like, oh right, okay, there's that again, there's that appreciation, there's that realization, or just an acknowledgement of even just a way that my brain works or thinks. I'm like, oh wow, I don't have, that's unhealthy, or here's something I can change. Yeah, just the
Totally.
layers of learning how to sit with that uncomfortable feeling is so important. Such
So
an
important. Yeah. Yeah, totally. I've been thinking about that a lot, like the discomfort and sitting with discomfort and just the value of that. And, psychedelics or not, it feels like our culture prizes the exact opposite, like remove discomfort at all costs. Discomfort is bad, but it's like you said, like then you're just focusing on, I don't know, the yin or the yang, but not like both sides, and there's an imbalance that happens, and then we run away from discomfort. And yeah, we can just expand our windows of tolerance and our capacity to be in the world and to understand all these aspects of ourselves just by like turning toward and sitting with discomfort.
which you talked about that in your book too, like about how psychedelics as tools rather than magic cures. These are not like, how do you think that, like, how would you think that distinction is misunderstood today? Do you tend to feel like most people think I'll take it if it will fix me?
Yeah, I've seen that a lot in like my work in the therapy side of things, and people who come in wanting to try ketamine therapy. And I have a lot of compassion for that because there's a lot of suffering behind that. It's usually people who have tried so many things and like they just want something to work, and they read something in the New York Times or heard Michael Pollan or something like this, and like they have this hope. But I think there's a recorrection happening now because the hope got too high, and it was kind of, I think these were being seen as panaceas, like just like the magic cure for so many things that are actually way more complicated than just like the name or number of a diagnosis or something like that, like stuff that roots way deeper. And the way I was describing it yesterday on this a podcast that I was on um, is um, where was I going with that? Um,
Talking about how these aren't magic cures, or how maybe ketamine is not going to fix your problem after
right. Thank you. Thank
one
you.
dose.
Yeah,
Unfortunately,
yeah. Kind of that it's like a Western thing to look
our
toward.
pill popping culture. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, like pill popping or like buy this solution in the form of a self-help program or this or that. And I'm not knocking these things, but like there's a grasping for the thing that will change everything for the better. And especially when it comes to like medicines, pharmaceuticals or psychedelics, I think there's a tendency to just want to take this and be completely passive. Like the only action I have to do is take this, show up at a therapist's office, and then pay a certain amount of money, and then I'll be good. And it's just, that's not how it works usually. Maybe some people have that amazing experience, but I think people lose the sense of a sense of like active participation in the process, and that it does require some hard work, and it's like you alluded to earlier, like psychedelics are tools for a broader process of, I don't know, selfhood or self-development or individuation, as Jung said, of just like being a person who's introspective and healing their deeper wounds. And yeah, just to contextualize it in that sense, I think is important.
So I mean, I refer to back to this saying and sentiment a lot. Like psychedelics open the door, but you have to continue to walk through it. You can't. They're not going to hold your hand across the threshold. You have to make the decision to keep going. Which, to me, that's kind of the essence of integration. Psychedelics come in and sort of like do their thing internally, but you have to continue to move forward. So, in your therapy work, how do you talk with people about integration and what does that look like from a practical perspective. You know, people ask me like, what does that mean? Like, think about it. Like, I just go home and think about it. You know, how do we talk to people to help them better understand this moving forward process?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the questions, if not like the question of this whole field that still feels like unanswered. And there's so much room to explore. And like in my own life and work, I mean, the more I've done it, the more I'm just turning toward habits, toward habit change. It's talking about integration is not as exciting as talking about like a challenging experience or like, going to the depths of your soul and contacting your great grandparents or something. Like, it's like, no, like when you wake up tomorrow, like change your habits. Like this thing that you do right out of waking up, of maybe checking your phone or doing this thing that is kind of helping churn these cycles that you want to change. Like we have to change those. And I'd like to talk about like the neuroplasticity of that window after psychedelics to encourage, like, this is a really good time to kind of start shifting these habits and helping them. If sometimes it comes up in the psychedelic experience, like they're just like, oh yeah, the way I do this particular behavior is just kind of reinforcing these negative ways of thinking about myself or something like that. So yeah, the more I do it, the more it's just like turning to practical things like that and seeing the psychedelic as a way to help that process of habit change, because it is so hard to do, especially when habits have been going on for so long. But it seems to me that when people don't do that, they almost inevitably, like, the habits will just kind of bring them back to how they felt before.
That's a good point. Like I think that's a great way to frame it that I haven't quite heard before, which is like it's almost like capitalizing on your afterglow, right? Like, hey, you're going to wake up tomorrow and you're going to feel a certain way and it's probably going to be different than how you normally feel. You know, you've had this substance moving through your body, you had this emotional and mental experience, like ride the wave and start changing habits, because you're right, like the only way that we're going to literally change the grooves in our brain is with repeated practicing something over and over again. If you need to wake up every day and drink a glass of water first thing when you wake up, the only way that's going to become a habit is to literally just get your ass out of bed and start doing it every day.
Yeah,
I
totally.
like so that's just it. Like,
Yeah,
you know,
don't need to overcomplicate it.
yeah,
Like,
like sorry, but like it's actually just this physical thing you have to do. You know, if you want to work out, you gotta just actually touch your toes, put your shoes on. Like,
uh-huh.
nothing's going to just all of a sudden make you be the better person that you think you're going to be, except for you. But the psychedelics do, I think, like, I say this about microdosing too. I like to microdose with both LSD and psilocybin. I think are both fantastic tools for microdosing. But I describe it as like, this doesn't take away my problem. Like I'm still getting up and I still encounter these hurdles in my day, but rather than stopping in front of them, just like, oh my God, how am I going to get over this hurdle? It's just like, I'm just going to hop right over it, or I'm going to slip right under it, or I could just walk right around that one today. Or, it just makes it easier to process the task at hand. It doesn't remove the barriers of being human and being in a human body. And, I think that's kind of the beauty of the psychedelic experience, really. Like, yeah, it's not a magic bullet, but man, it sure can help you process things in a simpler way, I guess.
Totally. And yeah, when you were talking about that, it made me think of like Viktor Frankl and like man's search for meaning, and like this notion of like how there's a stimulus and we have a response, and like in the space between those is a kind of like freedom. And often we'll have a default response just from the stimulus, but like the way you were describing, like being on a microdose and like this obstacle comes up and you can like kind of maybe take stock a little more, like tune into what is happening for you and have a little more like autonomy in how you respond instead of just being like kind of like yanked with a marionette string or whatever.
Yeah,
Just
yeah. In
let
your
it,
same old patterns. And, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
just shake up the patterns
Shake
for
up the
sure.
patterns. Um, okay, I want to switch gears a little bit because the book, it kind of like weaves together science and personal stories and indigenous wisdom practices. Like there's a lot of like themes that are well braided together. When you were writing the book, like what did you come across a lot of challenges weaving these together to write one cohesive story? There's some big pillars here that you brought together so beautifully. What was the writing process like?
Um, Thank you for um, saying that. I appreciate that reflection. The answer to like, was it challenging? Yes. That yeah, it drove me nuts. It was very hard. The structure piece, like in particular,
Right.
and a lot of that has to do with like how I write. I guess there would be a lot of reasons to advise against writing the way that I do, and most of them have to do with actually wrangling all the threads that I've like spontaneously written about and bringing them back together and weaving them into something that feels structured and isn't totally random. Because I love the process. Like I write by hand, and I love the process of just like sitting with a journal and a pen and like following these little like tendrils or threads of like what feels alive or lights me up or what I'm interested in. So that it doesn't feel like an obligation. Like if I feel like I'm writing from a place of obligation, like that's probably how someone's going to feel reading this.
That's a
And
good point. That's a good point. It's a good
yeah,
tip for writers.
yeah, that's kind of like yeah, an operating principle as a writer. So yeah, if any writers are tuning into this, you find your own style, but might consider that. Perhaps I've heard other people describe that too. But yeah, then the problem with that, with like the way I did it, is then I've got just like all these pieces all over the place, and like, where does this fit? Like, how does this go? And I mean, it was like it was kind of like trying to figure out the structure and like solve this very complex puzzle, like all the way until like I had to submit my last edit. Like I feel like it was in the last like 2 months, and definitely with a lot of help from a developmental editor that I got to work with. Alice Peck is her name, and she was awesome, just so helpful with bringing this together. Yeah, I couldn't have done it without her. But I feel like I had some kind of uh, breakthrough insights like towards the end about like how to sequence the chapters, and because now it's kind of like built around the different substances now. Before that it was kind of more like topical, and it would just like weave in different substances. So yeah, that yeah, I mean I took some liberties. It's not like everything in every chapter is about that substance, but I tried to at least find like common themes like for a given chapter to
Well,
keep it
it
feeling
came
tight.
together really well, and I think it felt very tight from start to finish. And yeah, I got lost in it. I thought it was a great book.
Thank you.
One of the things that I think really stood out to me, and perhaps because it's just something I've been thinking about a lot lately, is indigenous traditions and the balance of honoring indigenous wisdom with providing wider access to plant medicines. And I think it's something I wrestle with, and a lot of people have different opinions. There's, on the one hand, it feels disingenuous to say that we can just westernize so many of these medicines and plug them into our channels in the way that we have with modern medicine. And on the other hand, I really want global access for people and safe access for people so that they can experience these substances for what they are as well, through their own healing journey. Can you speak a little bit about your personal opinion or some of the research you came across for your book about where we are right now and where we should be thinking about in the future of how we balance indigenous wisdom with our modern commercialization of psychedelics?
Yeah. So are you kind of wondering about like any of the particular like traditions, like the kind of like North American peyote kind of stuff, or kind of a more broadly
I'm thinking
speaking?
just kind of in a broad context, but if there's a
Yeah,
particular substance that maybe serves as a great example, whether that's ayahuasca or peyote or even psilocybin, maybe there's something in there that we can use as an example or reference point.
sure. Yeah. I will say I don't feel like like I felt pretty with the wave when around when the book came out or a little before, like kind of up to date with stuff in the psychedelic world. And that was June. I'm not sure when this is going to come out, but at this time, it's about 6 months ago or so. And I haven't really read much since, but like heartbreak from stuff. So, in terms of like the more recent developments and conversations about this, I'm not quite up to speed, but I'm sure a lot of the same themes are still playing
Mhm.
out and turning over. Um, it's really hard, I think, to it can be hard to hear indigenous voices because lots of times they don't have a platform, and there's just a lot of noise in this field about this and that, but you can find them, and it takes some effort and listen to them. So I think first and foremost, just like listening to what indigenous people are saying. And um, peyote's been really controversial. From I think the first I heard about it was probably like 2019 or something, when it was included on a decriminalized nature ballot, that I think might have passed, and some leaders in the Native American church took issue with that because they had fought for so long for the right to use their sacred cactus that they'd been using for a really long time before Europeans arrived. And just like hearing that and like learning more about the history was really impactful for me personally, and talking to a couple folks on the indigenous side of things, just because there's such a different worldview of like what this cactus is, and how to treat it, and how it's interwoven with just a much broader like relationship with and respect for the natural world and a spiritual worldview. And there is a history of colonists and Westerners like taking what they want, and um, like a kind of extractive mentality, like maybe affecting a kind of goodwill, but like just having a very itemized mechanistic view of the world. Like, I am entitled to take what I want to use for my purposes. And there's a big conflict between those ideologies, to where from the indigenous point of view, that could be very disrespectful and very yeah, egotistical, and lead to a lot of problems over time, which yeah, degradation of the natural world, over extraction of resources. I mean, so many different things. Um, so for people, I think, who are drawn to intrigued by plant medicines, I think it's important to, if you're kind of like me, from like a very Western perspective, um, I think it's a helpful thing and important to take some time to analyze where that's coming from in yourself. Is it just like, oh, that'll be fun? Like, I want to be a psychonaut and, take this thing. And it's hard to take a strong moral stance on something, because like at the same time, I'm like, who am I to say like that's inherently wrong or something like that? Um, but I think it's a really, if there's going to be like an incorporation of this vast body of knowledge from a whole diversity of indigenous traditions that have certain common factors from around the world, it'll take a lot of like listening to and respecting and reframing certain worldviews that were indoctrinated into the West that are more like, this is taken for this purpose. So yeah, that'd be my encouragement: people to really look into where their impulses are coming from. If it feels like it's just selfish, maybe reconsider that, or at least pause um, to look at other perspectives and learn learn from the people for whom this particular plant medicine is sacred, like why it's sacred, what it means to them. And um, yeah, I think there can be a respectful attitude in that way.
And the word that I just kind of like keep thinking of as I'm listening to is just intention. There's just so much power in the intention that you have. And I think that's something else that we could look to indigenous cultures to model as well, like slower ways of life, working with the natural world so much more intentionally, not just galvanizing resources left and right. And that's not to say too, like, I don't think that psychedelics have to be like reserved only for like deep individual, spiritual ceremonies. Like heading to the gorge with your friends for a music festival is medicine in its own right too. You know what I mean? Like there's things like that I think, again, like when we just look at intention and setting, I think we can talk about a broader context too. It doesn't just have to be on a couch with a therapist in a very medical. I think, there's room for both. There could be room for both of those things, and they're both super valid. Something that I'm leery of, just because I've worked in the cannabis industry for a really long time, and I've walked companies through, from the medical industry to the recreational industry, and then into the national hemp industry, and just kind of seen all of the different things change, not just with the product itself and what we've done to cannabis in a lab, but interest from pharmaceutical companies and like larger corporations wanting to get their slice of the pie. I'm a little nervous about the future of psychedelics, I suppose. Do you think that we have any reason to be concerned that pharmaceutical industries will want to kind of co-opt some of these substances or create their own synthetic versions and, here's your pill? Do you think that's a valid concern that we should have, or do you think there'll always kind of be authentic and protected use of these outside of that universe?
I think it's a valid concern. I do think there will always be underground access points outside of regulatory bodies. Like there have been, but yeah, in terms of the like incorporating or integrating psychedelics into Western culture as like a very helpful thing for people, and just the vast variety of mental and just different complicated ailments that folks are really struggling with these days. I think it's a super valid concern. It was a couple years ago now, and started hearing for the first time about like biotech companies trying to like create psychedelics without the trip. It's just like, what? Like, what are you talking
Why are we
about?
doing
Like,
that? Yeah.
yeah, it doesn't. It to remove subjectivity from the experience and like the value of a personal experience of a non-ordinary state, and to reduce it to just like some kind of chemical thing, like can make sense with different medicines, but it just feels like it's completely missing the point of psychedelics to me. And it does feel like there's like a wave that's like anti-therapy at this point. Partly with I think, yeah, with the MAPS stuff with the FDA and getting MDMA assisted therapy getting rejected for approval. And, it's been a controversial thing in ketamine therapy for a while. Like, how important is the therapy? Do you need it? Or can you go to one of these ketamine infusion centers where they just jack you up with ketamine and leave you in a room? You can probably tell from my tone which side I fall on there.
Well, it comes back to what we were saying too about the importance of integration, which how can somebody learn about integration unless there's some type of opportunity for that education to be transferred, you know?
Yeah, totally. But yeah, I guess to kind of conclude on this, I feel like one of the best things that our culture, society can get from psychedelics is like a broader reframe about what health and healing means, and to make it more nuanced than just like taking a pill or just like some kind of chemical thing that's gonna get changed from this pill or whatever. That psychedelic therapy, I think in particular, but beyond that too, psychedelic healing can help people be more, once again, active participants in their own healing process, to see their struggles as, I mean, some of them is just inevitable of being human, and others as being, the playing out of these like deep patterns or trends that they can actually influence and shift over time. And I think that, yeah, this push toward removing the introspective qualities and like this inner work aspect, because we worship, this culture worships science, and it's hard to make that like strictly scientific. And then people are like, oh, it's a cult, like, it's like woo woo.
And that's part of what I love about psychedelics too, is like you have to respect the balance of science and spirituality if you want to get the most out of psychedelics, because there's so much to both sides. Like there is a lot of science going on there that we're observing and researching, and we could go find a million papers on XYZ substance and look at that. But yeah, you can't deny what's happening on a, yeah, if you want to call it woo woo or spiritual or religious or whatever anybody wants to put to it, but that is happening. There are some things that are happening there that you're not going to see in a lab.
Exactly. Yeah, you're not measuring that with like a microscope.
Yeah, like I'm sorry, but we can't, we can't do research on DMT entities. Like that's just not, you can't, like, we can't go to the waiting room of a breakthrough dose somewhere and talk about the oxygen levels of that space or whatever. Like it's just not something we can explore.
Uh-huh. Yeah, totally. And yeah, I think, yeah, there's a lack of humility in the scientific establishment, because it's like, if science can't study it, they don't say like, oh, well, that's a limitation of science. They just say like, oh, that's unscientific what you're talking about.
Right.
Well, it's because your tools are limited.
Yeah, yeah. We've been trying to figure that realm out. We don't know yet, guys. Like, let's keep looking.
Yeah, yeah,
Or
totally.
let's just let the magic exist.
I know. Yeah, I feel like such categorical culture, and like find opposition. Like it can't be these two things at the same time. It's this or that. And I was really hopeful when I was writing the book about like kind of some kind of spirituality or mysticism coming back into the scientific literature with like Johns Hopkins stuff, and um, yeah, and beyond. And it feels like there's been a big pushback against that in recent memory, which I guess isn't surprising, but is a little just like, oh, really? Like, okay, we're still going to act like this is just people that are crazy making stuff up, even
Yeah,
though
just
people have
high.
been,
You're just
yeah,
high.
yeah, yeah, just high. Yeah. Hmm.
It kind of brings us back full circle to the top of our conversation about that childlike wonder, right? Because like that's something that's like relatable for people to digest. Like, it's hard to remember what it does feel like to be a kid, but then when you experience psychedelics and you just get that wave of easy joy and relaxation, that is what it's like to be a kid, right? Like before we got kind of infiltrated with this death and taxes of the world around us, just that easy feeling. And again, it's not ubiquitous. Not everybody had that childlike experience, but
Yeah.
you know,
In innocence.
yeah, that innocence. But yeah, if you do want to chase that little glimmer of that feeling, psychedelics can kind of help you remember how to play and feel joy. And I don't need a scientific explanation for that. I'm happy to experience that and enjoy it for what it is. I don't have to know why it's happening. Like I'm just I'm grateful for that for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Okay, well, one last question I have for you, Sean, and that's, it might sound basic, but I think everybody always has a little bit of a different answer is what kind of advice would you offer somebody who's looking to explore psychedelics for the first time? Would you point them in the direction of a particular substance or starting on their own or finding a therapist? Like where should people who are curious and new begin?
Well, it's really important to like get an understanding for yourself of like your own personal like acceptance of risk, because there is a risk in like doing any of this and seeking out something that, with the exception of a few things like mushrooms in Colorado, like it's probably illegal. So, be honest with yourself about like potential consequences and how much you're willing to accept in terms of risk. If someone is looking to kind of explore the therapeutic side, doesn't know where to start, I mean, I highly recommend ketamine assisted therapy. Um, I've just seen amazing things happen with clients with it. And yeah, I practice on like the psycholytic side. So like lower doses via like oral routes of administration, troches or lozenges. So I'm kind of biased toward that. I like that approach. But yeah, there's ketamine therapy is by far, the most accessible one. It's the only like legally accessible. I still hesitate to call it a psychedelic, but it's still kind of lumped into
In the category,
this
yeah.
and has some common qualities. So I would recommend looking into that, and in your area or another area, if you're willing to travel, and make sure that it's psychedelic assisted therapy or ketamine assisted therapy and not, ketamine infusions where you'd just be left in a room. Some of those websites will say it's ketamine therapy. So you got to like read the fine print and,
Mm.
make sure if you're looking for the therapeutic side of things. If people are looking kind of more on the recreational side, I think microdosing is a good way to start. Just kind of like, don't go, I wouldn't recommend going like a super high dose right out of the gates. Some people would, and ultimately it's a personal choice. But, if you're nervous about it, kind of acquainting at lower doses can be with psilocybin and LSD, I think in particular, can be a good way to go. But yeah, to not rush into it, I guess would be a kind of generalized statement. Like there's just, if you feel a sense of rush, like calm your breathing, dial it back, like really touch into like, why do I feel so rushed about this? You probably don't need to be as rushed as maybe you feel, and just be as safe as you possibly can, however you choose to do it.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Can we expect any more books in your future? Working on the next one yet?
Not quite on the next one yet. Trying to give myself a little time.
Okay.
But yes, yeah, totally.
Someday.
I
Okay.
hope to keep writing books as long as I'm around.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining us today.
Totally. Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's good to talk to you.